They told their daughters that the sea sings blessings on a wedding night. But the truth behind why Viking princesses were afraid of their first wedding night is a song most skalds refused to recite. For 600 years, whispers of that night were buried beneath frost and ash, censored by churchmen, softened by court poets, and silenced by families who preferred their legends clean. Yet in the longhouses of kings, terror had a language of its own. Here is what the sagas do not say. In the blue hush before dawn, when smoke still clung to the rafters and the fjord lay flat as hammered silver, a girl of royal blood was led through a doorway no one could follow. She did not go as a bride. She went as a pledge. Her name is lost to the public verses, but the annals call her the Swan of Lade, daughter of a war king whose ships stitched fear across the North Atlantic. Her marriage was a bargain inked in iron, and the first night was its seal. Why were these daughters afraid? Because the bride night in the age of Jarls was not only flesh and vows, it was a ritual of power, a trial staged to prove more than purity, to break more than resistance. Witnesses waited. Oaths hovered. Proof was demanded. And if the omens faltered, the weight of blame fell upon the girl, never the groom, never the clan that traded her. If you think Viking weddings were all feasts and laughter, you are hearing half a saga. Stay with me, because the path from the Hall of Gifts to the hidden chamber reveals a machinery older than kingdoms, tuned to obedience and sharpened by fear. The sagas praise the might of the Jarls, their raids, their treasures, their gods. But the chronicles that monks preserved in margins, where ink turned hesitant and words were smudged, speak of another truth, that the Viking princess was never simply a bride. She was a token of war, bartered like silver, her body pledged as treaty between clans that had carved each other bloody for generations. Her wedding feast, lit with torches and dripping boar fat, was a theater of triumph. Poets sang of honor, warriors slammed horns of mead against the tables, and the king's men shouted blessings into the smoky rafters. Yet beneath that thunder, one voice was always silent, the bride's. She sat draped in silk and amber beads, her hair woven with golden thread, a crown of reindeer bone balanced on her head. She smiled because she must. She listened because she had no choice. For her, each toast and cheer echoed the same truth. Her freedom had been sold in exchange for peace. But peace had its price, and it was demanded not in the hall, but in the chamber that waited after. In the cold silence beyond the feast fires, another ritual awaited. It was called the Brudkaupsnacht, the bridal night. Every Viking knew its name. Few dared to whisper its details. Unlike the feasts, this ritual was never sung by the skalds. No harp carried its melody. It belonged to shadows, to the silence between screams, to a tradition so feared that later generations tried to erase it completely. For the daughters of kings, it was the true beginning of marriage, a night that tested more than loyalty and demanded more than vows. And for centuries, they endured it in silence. The chronicles say the Vikings honored their women, that queens rode beside kings in carved sleighs, that shield maidens carried swords into battle, that mothers ruled the hearth with iron authority. But the bridal night showed another face of their world, a face carefully hidden. In those hours after the feast, the princess was not merely handed to her husband. She was delivered to a ritual older than the sagas themselves, one the church later branded unholy and tried to bury under silence. The bride was led into a chamber sealed with oak beams and iron locks. Torches burned low, casting shadows that stretched like claws across the walls. Witnesses stood outside, not inside, elders of the clan, the groom's kin, and sometimes even the priest of Thor or Christ, depending on the century. Their ears strained for proof, for this was no union of hearts, but a test staged for all. The terror was not in the groom's face, though many were strangers to the bride. It was in the expectation that the night must produce evidence, a sheet stained with blood, a cry overheard. Proof that the daughter of a king had been subdued, her innocence broken, her body claimed. Without it, whispers of dishonor spread like wildfire. A failed bridal night could topple alliances, ignite feuds, or condemn the princess to shame worse than death. And so, trembling beneath veils of linen, Viking princesses stepped into the chamber, knowing that the ritual was not private. It was a performance demanded by clan, by gods, by the brutal machinery of power. Their fear was not of love, nor of marriage. It was of the ritual itself, sharpened by generations and censored for 600 years. The ritual began with silence. The groom was not the first figure she saw. Instead, it was the matron, an elder woman of the clan, keeper of traditions whispered from mother to daughter. Her task was not kindness, it was inspection. The princess was stripped of her wedding veil and examined under torchlight. Every braid undone, every jewel removed. Her body searched for marks of shame or signs of rebellion. Her hair, once woven in golden crowns, was loosened into wild strands, an ancient symbol that her maidenhood no longer belonged to herself. Then came the chanting. Depending on the century and region, the words shifted. Sometimes invocations to Freya, goddess of fertility, sometimes Christian prayers repurposed to sanctify dominance. But their purpose was the same, to remind the girl that her body was no longer her own. It belonged to clan, to gods, to the bargain sealed in the hall. The cruelty sharpened in what followed. The bed was not simply a bed. It was arranged like an altar, its sheets snow-white, its wood carved with runes of binding and blood. At dawn, those sheets had to bear witness. Failure was not an option. If no stain appeared, accusations of deceit would follow, and punishment fell not on the groom, but on the bride. The groom entered only after this ritual was complete, often drunk with mead, sometimes urged by kinsmen who jeered outside the chamber doors. For him, the night was conquest. For her, it was trial. This was why Viking princesses feared their wedding night. Not because of marriage, not because of love, but because the ritual was designed to strip them of both, reducing them to symbols of obedience, their cries silenced by the very songs that praised their fathers. What the feast celebrated, the chamber enforced. For Viking princesses, terror lay not in the unknown, but in what they already knew awaited them. Older sisters whispered warnings. Mothers wept in silence. Servants who had seen too much vanished into exile. The ritual was not a secret among women. It was a curse passed from one generation to the next. One part was spoken of only in fragments, the blood test. The elders demanded proof of virginity, and proof was never left to chance. If the night ended without blood, whispers of sorcery or corruption would spread. To prevent scandal, some brides were secretly wounded beforehand by the matrons themselves. Scratches cut into the thigh or hand, just enough to stain the linen. Better the cruelty of kin than the wrath of clans. But not every bride was spared. Some grooms, coached by kinsmen, treated the night as spectacle. They were told to ensure blood by force, to break resistance so thoroughly that no one could question the ritual's success. And while the chamber doors were closed, everyone waited outside, ears pricked for sounds that proved domination. A scream was not shame, it was confirmation. For the princess, there was no escape. If she resisted too fiercely, her cries could be twisted into accusations of dishonor. If she submitted silently, she was praised as obedient but broken. Either way, her fate was sealed in the sheets by dawn. It is no wonder that later chroniclers, faced with these truths, wrote in veiled riddles or chose silence altogether. The sagas skipped the screams, the monks blackened their ink. For 600 years, the ritual survived in whispers, until fragments of hidden records revealed what really happened behind oak doors. By dawn, the feast fires had burned low, and the horns of mead stood empty. Outside the bridal chamber, the elders demanded the proof, the stained sheet, the token of honor that would silence doubt and seal alliances. If the evidence was produced, the clan roared in triumph, declaring the night a victory. If it was not, whispers spread like poison, and the princess bore the blame. But what followed inside those walls did not vanish with the rising sun. For many Viking princesses, the brudkaupsnatt was not the beginning of marriage, it was the breaking of the self. Chronicles describe young brides who fell silent in the days after, speaking only when forced, their voices reduced to whispers. Some refused food altogether, their bodies wasting away until servants had to force broth past their lips. The monks who recorded these cases gave them names like melancholia virginalis, virginal melancholy. In modern words, it was trauma, carved so deep into spirit and memory that no feast or crown could erase it. Others displayed sudden terrors. The mere sight of a man, even a servant, was enough to trigger trembling, cold sweats, and collapse. And yet no saga sang of this suffering. No skald carved verses of fear into stone. To the outside world, the princess appeared adorned, dutiful, present at ceremonies beside her new husband. But within the longhouse walls, she was hollowed, her laughter gone, her eyes vacant, her body present, but her spirit absent. These stories were erased from public record, censored not by chance, but by design. Because to reveal them was to admit that the might of jarls and kings was built not only on swords and ships, but on the silent sacrifices of their daughters. The tragedy of the Viking bridal night was not the burden of one princess alone. It was a cycle, repeated across generations, etched into the dynasties of the north like runes into stone. Every daughter of a jarl knew her fate long before she ever saw the bridal chamber. She had been raised for it, trained in silence, molded to obedience by mothers who carried the same scars. Hidden chronicles tell of princesses who sought escape. One feigned sickness for weeks before her wedding, collapsing suddenly at the altar in a desperate attempt to delay what she knew awaited. Another fled into the forests of Norway on the eve of her bridal night, only to be hunted down by kinsmen and returned in chains. Her disappearance was later struck from the records, her name erased as though she had never lived. Some fought back in ways less visible. Whispers of coded songs passed between sisters in longhouses, verses sung as lullabies but carrying messages of warning. Others turned to the old gods in secret, offering sacrifices to Freya or Hel, praying for strength or death before the bridal chamber doors closed. But resistance rarely changed the outcome. The machinery of power was merciless. A daughter was not her own. She was the flesh and blood currency of politics, traded to settle blood feuds, secure alliances, and strengthen fragile truces. The ritual of the wedding night was the guarantee that this exchange had been sealed beyond dispute. And so, across centuries, Viking princesses endured the same terror. Their names may differ, daughters of Lod, of Uppsala, of the Danish courts, but their cries echoed the same, silenced by oak doors, buried by censored chronicles, remembered only in fragments 600 years later. By the time the ritual reached its climax, the Viking princess was no longer simply a bride. She was a sacrifice, not to gods, not to her husband, but to the relentless demands of politics. The chamber was the altar, her body the offering, and the clan the beneficiary. What made the ordeal unbearable was that it was never truly private. Behind the oak doors, the young woman was stripped of choice, but outside, witnesses waited. The rustle of silk, the muffled sobs, even the silence itself, all of it became part of the judgment. Her pain was not hers alone. It was evidence, measured and weighed by men who never stepped inside. And the cruelty did not end with dawn. Some clans demanded that the bloodied sheets be displayed publicly, draped across doors or carried through the hall as proof of honor. Imagine the humiliation, the princess reduced to a spectacle, her suffering paraded as triumph, while the same warriors who cheered her father's victories roared with laughter and mead. Those who broke under the ritual's weight, those who collapsed into silence, madness, or illness, were not seen as victims. They were branded weak, sometimes cursed as ill-omened, sometimes quietly replaced in their husband's bed by another bride, their existence erased from record. This was the true terror of the bridal night. It was not just one moment of pain. It was a system perfected to strip dignity, ensure obedience, and remind the princess that her fate was never her own. The sagas celebrated victories on the battlefield, but the hidden victories, the ones that chained dynasties together, were written in blood-stained linen and silenced screams. For 6 centuries, these rituals lay buried beneath layers of silence. The sagas skipped them, monks erased them, and families scrubbed their daughters' suffering from the annals. Yet fragments survived, hidden in court records, whispered in folk songs, preserved in the margins of chronicles where cautious scribes dared not write too plainly. One such record speaks of a Norwegian princess who, on the night of her wedding, lost her voice entirely. For months after, she spoke not a word, communicating only with gestures. Clerics called it the curse of silence, but today we would name it trauma. Another tale tells of a Danish jarl's daughter who drowned herself in the fjord rather than endure the bridal chamber. Her name was struck from genealogies, her story retold only as a ghost legend meant to frighten children. These tragedies were not exceptions. They were patterns, recurring, systematic, and carefully hidden. The machinery of clan politics demanded obedience, and obedience was enforced through fear. The bridal night was not a celebration, but a weapon, perfected over generations to shatter a girl before she could ever become a wife. And yet, history does not remain buried forever. When Christian chroniclers in later centuries began compiling confessions and testimonies, they stumbled upon traces of the truth. Broken verses, erased names, sudden silences in family trees, each one a clue pointing toward what had been deliberately forgotten. Slowly, the censored story of the Viking bridal night surfaced, revealing that behind the glitter of feasts and the roar of victories lay a hidden ledger of suffering paid in the lives of daughters. For the first time in centuries, their cries, once trapped behind oak doors, were heard again. For 6 centuries, these rituals lay buried beneath layers of silence. The sagas skipped them, monks erased them, and families scrubbed their daughters' suffering from the annals. Yet fragments survived, hidden in court records, whispered in folk songs, preserved in the margins of chronicles where cautious scribes dared not write too plainly. One such record speaks of a Norwegian princess who, on the night of her wedding, lost her voice entirely. For months after, she spoke not a word, communicating only with gestures. Clerics called it the curse of silence, but today we would name it trauma. Another tale tells of a Danish jarl's daughter who drowned herself in the fjord rather than endure the bridal chamber. Her name was struck from genealogies, her story retold only as a ghost legend meant to frighten children. These tragedies were not exceptions. They were patterns, recurring, systematic, and carefully hidden. The machinery of clan politics demanded obedience, and obedience was enforced through fear. The bridal night was not a celebration, but a weapon, perfected over generations to shatter a girl before she could ever become a wife. And yet, history does not remain buried forever. When Christian chroniclers in later centuries began compiling confessions and testimonies, they stumbled upon traces of the truth. Broken verses, erased names, sudden silences in family trees, each one a clue pointing toward what had been deliberately forgotten. Slowly, the censored story of the Viking bridal night surfaced, revealing that behind the glitter of feasts and the roar of victories lay a hidden ledger of suffering paid in the lives of daughters. For the first time in centuries, their cries, once trapped behind oak doors, were heard again. When later historians pieced these fragments together, the scale of silence became clear. Across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, generations of royal daughters had endured the same night of fear, yet their names rarely appeared in sagas or chronicles. Their absence itself was evidence. The skalds who sang of kings in blood and steel went mute when it came to princesses in bridal chambers. Silence, after all, was its own kind of censorship. What remained were echoes. A folk ballad from Iceland about a bride who begged the sea to swallow her before nightfall. A runestone inscription where the name of a princess had been chipped away deliberately, as if erasure could erase memory. The private letters of missionaries shocked at the customs they found too scandalous to print, but too disturbing to forget. These traces show us that the fear of Viking princesses was not myth, but memory, carried quietly through centuries. Their voices may have been smothered, but the weight of their suffering seeped into the cultural soil, resurfacing in whispers, ghost stories, and half-forbidden songs. And when the church sought to civilize the North, these rituals were among the first targeted for suppression, not out of compassion, but because they exposed the raw brutality of clans whose power the church wanted to tame. So, the bridal night was censored, disguised as holy union, wrapped in hymns that hid its origins in blood and silence. Yet history does not forgive concealment forever. To uncover these stories today is not to invent scandal, it is to acknowledge the hidden cost of dynasties. The price of Viking power was not paid only on battlefields or in storm-tossed seas. It was paid in chambers of oak and iron, where daughters bore the weight of alliances in silence. Among the scattered records, some stories break through the silence with chilling clarity. In a 13th-century Danish chronicle, a young bride of noble blood is described as falling ill on her first night and never rising whole again. The chronicler avoids detail, but a marginal note written in another hand adds bluntly, "She screamed until her throat bled." In Sweden, ballads collected centuries later speak of the Bride of Frost, a princess who entered the chamber and emerged with hair turned white, though she was barely 16. Her legend became a fireside tale, but behind the myth likely stood a girl shattered by the ritual, her terror so deep it marked her body visibly. Norway preserved its own ghost story, the Silent Lady of Trondheim. She was said to wander palace corridors, eyes downcast, never speaking. The tale paints her as a phantom, but recent historians suggest she may have been a real princess who retreated into mutism after her bridal night, remembered not as a woman but as a shade haunting the halls of power. These fragments reveal a chilling truth. Viking society celebrated its victories in stone, song, and saga, but its losses, especially the suffering of its daughters, were buried beneath silence or twisted into legend to strip them of humanity. Each erased name, each veiled ghost tale, each censored chronicle adds to the same conclusion. The bridal night was not a romantic passage, but a systemic cruelty, refined and repeated for centuries. And so, when we uncover these stories now, we do not only recover history. We give voice to those whose cries were deliberately muted, whose lives became currency for peace, and whose memories demand to be heard. And that is why Viking princesses feared their wedding night. What was celebrated in halls of feasting was endured in chambers of silence. Behind oak doors, daughters of kings were reduced to tokens of politics, their voices buried, their dignity sacrificed, their fear censored for 600 years. The sagas tell us of great raids, shining swords, gods of thunder, and victories carved into stone. But the untold truth is that power was not sustained by warriors alone. It was upheld on the broken spirits of princesses, whose names were erased, whose stories survived only in whispers and shadows. History often paints the past in gold and glory. Yet here, when we peel away the verses, We see blood on the sheets, tears in the silence, and lives stolen by rituals too cruel to record openly. This is the cost of dynasties, the price hidden beneath crowns and banners, and perhaps that is the most haunting part, that for every Fatma Sultan in Ottoman palaces, for every silent lady in Viking courts, there were countless others across empires, kingdoms, and dynasties whose suffering never reached the page. Their silence warns us still, that power without compassion devours even its own blood. So, the next time you hear tales of Viking splendor, remember the voices cut from the sagas. Remember the daughters whose wedding nights were not beginnings, but endings. And remember that history's true face is never just the one carved in stone. It is also the one whispered in fear. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more untold histories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Which hidden story should we uncover next? Perhaps the dark fate of a Russian Tsarevna, a Chinese empress, or a European queen erased by silence. Because only when we tell their stories do we finally give them back their voices.